You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
3CR is radical radio, and that means more than just alternative current affairs and political coverage.
We're radical because we're an independent media outlet, owned and operated by the community.
We're radical because we give communities the control of their own shows, with their own music, in their own languages.
We're radical because we provide a media platform for communities to build their own power to create social change.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call us on 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Netneck. You like that? Community Radio Network. Netneck. God, it's time to retire. My name's Joseph Scone, hosting today's program. Now, this program has been heard across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. It comes to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. So, people say there's lots of things in the news. Well, there are. But before we get on to that, what's anarchy all about? Anarchos without rulers. It's a society that has without rulers, not without rules. Why without rulers? Because rulers are responsible for most of the atrocities that occur in the world today, whether it's secular rulers, religious rulers, you name it. People exercise authority, you have problems. So anarchy is a concept, is a political, social, philosophical, whatever you like to call it, movement that is based on trying to destroy, not society, but destroy the mechanisms which allow rulers to determine the lives of billions of people, and that is inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to break down hierarchy, to share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Exceptionally simple concepts. But when you look at how much energy, how many lives are lost in order to remove tyrants and rulers, you can understand that the anarchist struggle is a difficult struggle. The concepts are simple, the struggle is difficult. And all those of you who've listened to the Anarchist World this week, I congratulate you, for doing things, because that's the issue. I mean, I can talk all I like. I can be as erudite as I like. I can be as obtuse as I like. I can make things as simple as I like. But the reality is, it doesn't matter what I say. What matters is what you do ultimately to change society. Now, I'm going to talk about evil. E-V-I-L. I'm going to talk about 101 shades of evil. All right? Not 101 shades of grey or 50 shades of grey, whatever it was, but 101 shades of evil, because we've been heard the word bandied about recently in the digital world and the corporate-owned media and the government-guild at ABC. Everybody's talking about evil. All right? Now, obviously, the destruction of the synagogue in Ripponlea in Melbourne is an anti-Semitic attack. Simple. It's a place of worship for people for particular religious belief. It's a little bit like if a mosque or a temple or a church had been burned down. Okay? And it's been described as evil. The arson has been described as evil. And people paint graffiti and it's been described as evil. But there are shades of evil when you think about it. Is the destruction of almost 45,000 people in Gaza evil? Is the destruction of hospitals, schools, essential infrastructure in Gaza and southern Lebanon evil? Was the death of over 1,200 Israeli citizens in Israel on the 7th of October 2024 or 2023 evil? There are degrees of evil. Is the fact that almost 1.5 million children in this very rich, supposedly rich country living in poverty, is that evil? Well, I consider it to be evil, but we never hear about that described as evil. Is the denigration, marginalisation and ostracisation of First Nations people in this country evil? Well, I describe it as evil. Is our political leaders, that's right, leaders who divide the population to eventually rule, is that evil? Well, I describe that as evil. So there are grades of evil. I mean, if we're going to use the word evil to describe graffiti or arson, we need to really understand what evil is. Because, you see, unfortunately, the arson which destroyed the synagogue in Ripponlea is just the narrative that Israeli supporters in this country needed in order to continue to support and promote the activities of war criminals for which the International Court of Hague has put out arrest warrants. It's just the narrative. It's just the perfect narrative to equate anti-Israeli sentiment with anti-Semitism. And that's what we've seen the last few days, is we've seen the blurring of that division because the narrative has changed. Because some people believe that destroying a place of worship would somehow promote possibly the Palestinian struggle, or maybe the people involved in that arson attack were actually anti-Semites, neo-Nazis. Nobody knows at this particular point in time, but whoever was involved, what they've done is they have handed all the cards to pro-Israeli forces in this country, which now dominate the narrative. And people are becoming more and more concerned about promoting an anti-Israel position because of their activities, because of the war crimes committed in their so-called conflict, the carnage which is being carried out in the Middle East, with anti-Semitism. Now, a few facts about anti-Semitism. Irrespective of what we think or what we're told, it's not the Palestinian people who are responsible for the Holocaust. I mean, they are the victims of collective European guilt regarding the Holocaust, which saw them displaced from lands they had inhabited for over 2,000 years. Simple. The Holocaust was what helped create the State of Israel for 2,000 people. For 2,000 years, Jewish people in Europe had been ostracised, marginalised, herded into ghettos, killed. Not by Palestinians, but by European Christian forces. Let's not forget that. It wasn't the Palestinians who were responsible for the Holocaust, although they bore the price of European guilt because we, as a people, allow that grotesque horror to occur. Because we see it again. Because somehow people began to believe, because of effective propaganda from the Nazi Party and other authoritarian right-wing parties across Europe, that somehow the Jews were responsible for the situation they found themselves in. It's always nice to have a minority you can oppress, to blame for every evil on the planet. So what we saw is the growth of anti-Semitism as part and parcel of life in many, if not most, European countries over a period of 2,000 years. A story which was promoted by the Catholic Church during the ages. So the Holocaust, which was a European designed, promoted and carried out by Europeans in Europe, right? And, was carried out. The Holocaust became the issue which the Palestinian people were asked to pay the ultimate price, the dispossession of lands they'd inhabited for over 2,000 years. That was the price they had to pay for European guilt. That's the price they paid for European guilt, the Holocaust. Today, 70 years later, Palestinians are being asked to pay the price. And the narrative that we have in this country, that anti-Israeli sentiment is somehow equated to anti-Semitism, becomes stronger and stronger as anti-Semites in our community torch a place of worship. It's simple. So what's happened is everybody's following this new narrative, and governments are forced to come up with so-called solutions to tackle anti-Semitism, and everything else disappears. Everything else is irrelevant. It's irrelevant that 46,000 Palestinians in Gaza have died as a result of this carnage. It's irrelevant that over 17,000 of these are children, children. Those of you who've got children and grandchildren, think about how you would feel if that happened to your children or grandchildren. It's irrelevant that most of the deaths that have occurred in Palestine are not of Hamas fighters. It's irrelevant that many Palestinians in Gaza were never supporters of Hamas, which was responsible for the atrocities on the 7th of October 2023, and now they are paying a collective price. It's irrelevant that over 80% of Gaza has been reduced to rubble, that hospitals, places of worship, that's right, places of worship, mosques, churches, have been reduced to rubble. It's irrelevant that almost 100 Israelis continue to be hostages They've basically been forgotten by their government. It's irrelevant that Benjamin Netanyahu and his previous foreign minister have been designated as war criminals and arrest warrants have been issued for them by the International Court of The Hague. I mean, all these things are irrelevant. It's irrelevant as Israel's major ally in the Middle East, Mr. Assad, the tyrant who's been forced to flee to Russia, has disappeared. It's irrelevant that now that Assad, who was more interested in tyrannising his own people than actually, fighting Israel or actually talking about the Palestinian plight, it's irrelevant that we see Israel increase its territorial ambitions in Syria and that over 100 and possibly 200 air raids have been conducted by the Israeli army in Syria in the last 24 hours. Bombing what they say are military facilities, because obviously they're very concerned about a new front being opened up against Israel. So everything that has happened is totally irrelevant. It's irrelevant that over 100,000 people now have major injuries from the carnage that's occurred in Gaza and to a lesser extent in southern Lebanon, which I'll carry for life. It's irrelevant the pictures we see every day of the atrocities which are committed in Gaza because, we now have a situation in Australia where any anti-Israeli action or anti-Israeli talk or debate is somehow automatically anti-Semitism. It's irrelevant that there are a growing number of Jewish people around the world who are appalled by what's happening in Gaza. It's irrelevant that a two-state solution has now come off the table. It's irrelevant that the United States government, which supplies most of the weapons to Israel, continues to supply those weapons. It's irrelevant that the new President of the United States is going to support Netanyahu and his government to the hilt and continue to provide those weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, I use the words of mass destruction. So everything becomes irrelevant when the narrative changes, when they now try to ostracise us, those people who've been unhappy with the tactics, the brutality, the horror that's been unleashed on Palestinians, especially in the Gaza, an area half the size of Melbourne. It's irrelevant their children don't have access to enough food. It's irrelevant they don't have access to, basic medical facilities. It's irrelevant that apart from the 40+ thousand that have died as a direct consequence of the carnage that's occurred, that tens of thousands have died because of lack of medical aid, like medications, insulin, blood pressure medications, the ability to have an operation. That's all irrelevant, isn't it? It's all irrelevant because any voice that is raised against the Israeli state is somehow continue to be anti-Semitic. Let's not forget, although Benjamin Netanyahu and his mob would love Israel to become a Jewish theocracy, let's not forget that not every citizen in Israel is Jewish. But that's irrelevant, and as the narrative changes. So those people who think that through some violent act They are going to improve the situation. Some violent act in Australia are going to improve the situation for Palestinians. What they have done is they have become part and parcel of that narrative, that increasingly popular narrative in this country, the anti-Israeli sentiment equals anti-Semitism. So think about it. So don't be frightened of raising your voice. I am sure if any other sovereign nation state anywhere in the world was doing what Israel is doing in Palestine, southern Lebanon, and now in Syria, that nobody would criticise you for criticising them. We saw this with the Uyghurs in China. We see it we see it in the Ukraine. But when it comes to the state of Israel, when they are able to change the narrative to suit them, that any action, any voice, any word, any dissent against the horrors and atrocities that have been committed by the Israeli state, that's right, the Israeli state, in Gaza, southern Lebanon and Syria is somehow anti-Semitic, then we've lost the plot. So that's why it's important to continue to raise your voice, as I am raising my voice today on the Anarchist World this week, and highlighting that anti-Israeli sentiment regarding the current government's actions in no way is equated with anti-Semitism. It's about confronting tyranny and authoritarianism, irrespective of what cloak it wears, whether it wears an ideological cloak, whether it wears a religious cloak, is irrelevant. What is relevant is the authoritarian nature of a response that goes beyond every law, both natural and man and human-made, on this planet. You're listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's streaming live on 3cr.org.au. Let's move on. I could talk about this all the program, but I'm sure you want to move on. Now, why did I say Assad was Israel's major ally? Well, it was simple. The Israeli government of the last 13 years, a tyrannical government, which has been responsible for the death of over 1 million Syrians, its own citizens, was basically Israel's best friend in the Middle East, because Assad was more interested in using his security apparatus to control his own people and fight a civil war than saying boo to the Israeli authorities. And it's interesting, but horrendous, to see Israel's response to the overthrow of Assad, because what will happen now in the next few years is the opening up of a new front that Israel will have to deal with in the Golan Heights, a front which has been very quiet for many decades. So let's move on. My major concern about what's happening in Syria is the autonomous zone in North and East Syria. Now, people seem to have forgotten that there are a number of different entities. There were a number of different entities in northern Syria which were able to resist the Assad-led government. And some of these prospered, as we saw in Idlib. But also, let's not forget that in the northeast Syria, we have the growth of a society which in many regards mirrors the type of society we as anarchists want to create. a society based on direct democratic principles, a society which over 3 million people are now part of. And we've got the autonomous zone in north and east Syria, which are kind of very close to the Turkish border. And for the last few years, their major foes haven't been the Syrians or even the Russians. It's been Turkey, which has been sending drones consistently and continuously to the autonomous zone in an effort to destroy what they've created, in an effort to tyrannise and terrorise people to leave that particular zone. Now, next to that zone is a Kurdish zone, which has United States troops in it, and on the west side is the side where we saw the Salvation government grow stronger and stronger. Now, as the Salvation Army swept towards Damascus, their major backer, Turkey, has been Turkey in this particular offence towards Damascus. Now, our salvation, some type of salvation government will be cobbled together in Syria. We've already seen world power attempting to contain and control what is happening in Syria today. My major concern currently is what will happen to the autonomous zone in north and east Syria, whether they'll be forcefully reintegrated back into Syria or whether they'll be able to continue to govern themselves in a manner which in many regards reflects anarchist sentiments. Now, we did do a 10-part series about 2 years ago regarding this autonomous zone. So let's see what happens. But I think the important thing to remember is that area of the world is in a state of flux, and we're seeing the major powers, especially the USA, attempt to control and contain the type of society which will grow out of the ashes of the death of the Ba'ath Party and Assad. Let's move on. Every trade union in this country is on notice. Did you know that? Yeah? The CFMEU fiasco. Now, remember when the banking, financial sector was under pressure? Were they brought into administration by an act of Parliament? No. We didn't even see one major CEO or member of that financial sector appear in court at any charge. Remember when Robodebt went rogue? Nobody charged. Nobody. No administration. Remember when these financial institutions collapse and people, lose everything they've ever worked for? No, they're not put into... They may be put into administration through legal mechanisms, but you don't see an act of Parliament which puts them into administration. Now, currently, you may not realise this, there is a case which will be heard or is being heard in the High Court of Australia regarding the legality, constitutionally, about whether the Australian government has the power to actually put an organisation like the trade union, like the CFMEU, into administrations because of allegations which were made by the corporate-owned media. Allegations. If every time allegations are made about a particular institution by some corporate entity, do we allow legislation to be put in Parliament to put that organisation into administration, to remove its executive, to ban them from life? Or do we go through the normal legal processes which other privately owned financial institutions need to go through when they go, when they're put into administration or liquidated. And that's the problem. Has the government overreached its authority? Has it overreached its authority? And more importantly, every trade union in this country is on notice. Every trade union is on notice. If we have a Conservative government in the future, can they, with a majority in both houses of Parliament, can they push legislation through Parliament, constitutionally, which places a trade union into administrations because there are allegations which are made, and in all cases, unsubstantiated allegations? Think about it. Not just trade unions, but any organisations. Now remember, currently, the Attorney General has the power to ban any organisation in this country that he or she believes poses a potential threat to Australia. Potential threat. Not a threat, potential threat. And any person who continues to raise that flag can be jailed for up to 25 years. Now, I don't make this shit up. It happened after 9/11. The legislation is there. And when we heard that the arson at a synagogue at Ripponlea in Melbourne has now become a terrorist act, what that means is that any person who the authorities believe may have information, either even inadvertently, that may assist them in their investigations, can be held for up to 7 days, questioned, and if they refuse to answer questions, they can be jailed for 5 years. And then when they're released 7 days later, if they tell anybody, they can be jailed for up to 5 years. Now, if you think I'm making this up, look at the so-called anti-terror legislation that came into play after 9/11 in this country. And that raises an important question, a really important constitutional question. Because those of you who think that constitutional arrangements are irrelevant, think again. Think again. You see, when the Australian Constitution was enacted on the 1st of January 1901, it was enacted after a 10-year debate. And during that 10-year debate, sections of society that wanted human rights to be incorporated in the Australian Constitution were defeated. And the Australian Constitution is one of the few constitutions on the planet that does not have any major human rights. You've got, I think, 4 rights under the Australian Constitution as individual. You have no rights under the Constitution for the arbitrary, for protection against the arbitrary exercise of power by the state. None whatsoever. You do have theoretically a right to religion. You have a right not to be discriminated against, not because of your race or your religion. No, that's irrelevant. You can't be discriminated against in terms of legislation because of the state you live in, right? That's one of your freedoms. Could you imagine that? You supposedly got a right to fair compensation if your land is compulsorily acquired by the state. And that's about it. No right to vote. No right to political speech. The High Court found about 20 years ago that you can't have a parliamentary democracy without a right to freedom of speech, but it's an implied right, and that implied right only exists during an election period, not beyond that election period. So I could go on and on. You see, constitutions should be mechanisms via which minorities are protected. Everybody talks about majority rule. Majority rule without constitutional protections for minority is tyranny. if the majority of people in this country believe that blue-eyed 2-year-olds are the spawn of the devil and they should be executed, does that make that right? If the majority believe that all Muslims are terrorists, does that make it right? If the majority believes that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders should stop whinging and accept the fact that they were a conquered people, is that right? So majority rule does not necessarily free us from the prospect of tyranny, especially if you're a minority. Could be gender, could be race, could be anything. Think about it. It's interesting, isn't it? We have a constitution which doesn't protect minorities. So majority rule becomes, the fact. If the majority believed, as they did in Germany and Austria and Poland and Hungary and many other parts of Europe in World War II, that, pre-World War II, that the Jews were the enemy of the people and they needed to be eradicated, and I'm sure the majority did believe that, that made it right? Of course not. So democracy isn't about majority rule. Democracy is about rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. And when we give up our responsibilities as citizens and residents to a central authority, we create the mechanisms by which some of the most horrible atrocities can be carried out in our name. Now, Germany in the 1920s and 1930s was considered to be a civilised, sophisticated country. And it was in Germany that we saw the creation of institutions which carry out some of the most horrendous and barbarous acts in human history. That's a fact. That's a fact. So a constitution without protections for minorities is useless. And there's a big problem in Australia. Now, in some countries, you've got, like Switzerland, you've got citizens-initiated referendums, which means if a number of citizens believe an issue should be put to the people to decide, if that issue is decided in the positive, then it's incorporated in their constitutional arrangements. You see, in this country, constitutional change does not occur, as we saw during the Voice referendum, and it doesn't occur for a number of reasons. And the major reason is that only Parliament, through an act of Parliament in both houses, both the lower house and the upper house, can actually put questions to the Australian people. And no wonder the Australian people become suspicious of parliaments which put questions to them, which in many cases increase their powers at the expense of everybody else. Now, a lot of people say, well, if you've got citizens-initiated referendums, you have chaos. The fact is, if you have constitutional arrangements to protect minority rights and citizens-initiated referendums, you have democracy, not chaos. Let's move on. There must be a federal election in the air. I can smell it. The Murdoch media, poor old Rupert's got problems at 93, but we won't go into his family issues. You know, the Murdoch media is an overdrive. Overdrive. Mr. Albanese can do no right. Do no right. Every day we have stories which are picked up by the digital world about how incoherent, useless, They are. And that we need to turn to the saviour, you know, Mr. Dutton, the leader of the opposition, to save ourselves from total, utter desolation and disaster. We see the old warriors, the culture warriors, come out to the fore. We see the Murdoch media and their hangers-oners in the digital world promoting Mr. Dutton as the Prime Minister. Nothing more, nothing less. So you see, Mr. Dutton is a very wise man. A very wise man. Remember Mr. Abbott? We never thought he could be Prime Minister of Australia. And what happens? Divide and rule. Question everything. Divide and rule. Black and white. African gangs. Jews. Arabs. Divide and rule. Divide and rule. White and black. One Australia. Workers and CEOs. Divide and rule. Very effective tactic if you let it succeed. And the problem is, when you have a legacy media which determines what happens in the digital world to a significant degree in terms of the policies and ideas which are debated in society and which occur in society, and you don't confront this division, then you've got a problem, a real problem, because you have the same problem that we see in the United States of America, a divided nation. And divided nations ultimately get nowhere. And they get nowhere because they spend all their time fighting amongst each other. For example, Mr. Dutton and his cohorts are pushing a nuclear agenda. Now, look, I can understand pushing a nuclear agenda in some subarctic place where there's no sunshine. Although in Iceland, it's 100% renewable because of the hot springs they have. That's interesting, just in case you thought that you can't have renewables in an Arctic setting. Here we have a big country, lots of sunshine, lots of wind, and they're talking about nuclear power. Now, Mr. Dutton knows that 1 + 1 = 2, and he realises that his nuclear policy equals 3. So what he does, and this is something you've got to watch, because he's aided and abetted by a Murdoch-led media, he tries to deflect the debate. Deflect the debate from real issues to debate about the culture wars. I'm not going to stand in front of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flag. Well, what do you expect from him? He didn't even turn up at the apology. He turned his back on the apology. You know, what do you expect? As if that's news. And while we debate and redebate the so-called culture wars, what we see is Mr. Dutton doing a Bradbury. Straight through the middle. Watching the opposition fall over themselves. The Greens fighting Labor. Labor fighting the Greens. Although they've got policies they could come to some arrangement about, as we saw recently. Then we've got Mr. Dutton dog whistling. Every divisive issue. Currently he's, all about pro-Israel. Because if you're anti-Israel, you're anti-Semite. He's latched onto that, running with it, down the street. He saw how he was able to sabotage the Voice referendum, and now he's running down the street, using the same analogies, What do we owe Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders? We owe them nothing, he keeps telling us. What about renewable energy? Oh, it's irrelevant. And the list goes on and on. So you're in for a nice ride the next 4 to 5 months. Divide and rule. Trade unions, criminal organisations. They all need to be taken out. Put them all in administration. The right to protest, My God. Let's get rid of it. For example, New South Wales, Victoria, right? Arson at a synagogue in Ripponlea. Legislation to be put in place to prevent people from demonstrating outside places of worships. Now, there's a lot of places of worships. You know, there's Seventh-day Adventists, there's Methodists, there's Muslims, there's Sunni, there's Shia, there's Church of Scientology, there's the Roman Catholic Church, there's the Church of England, there's temples, there's Sikhs, plenty of places of worship. What does that mean when you put legislation to prevent people from protesting outside of a place of worship? Does it mean when Cardinal Pell had the funeral at St. Patrick's and survivors of the Catholic Church's policies regarding pedophilia within the Catholic Church, does that mean they're going to be arrested because they're protesting outside a church? Does it mean, say, victims of Scientology protesting outside a Scientology centre because it's a recognised religion? Will they be prosecuted? Does it mean possibly people protesting outside a Church of England because they're unhappy with the ordination of women? Will they be arrested because they're protesting outside a particular place of worship? It's ludicrous. People just react because somehow the media thinks this is the issue of the day. The government gelded ABC, the corporate-owned media in all its formats, both digital and legacy, push this and government jumps to attention, as we saw with the CFMEU dispute. Allegations, that's right, allegations, that's all they were, allegations in some corporate-owned media entity, and all of a sudden you pass legislation and you put a major union in this country into administration. Extraordinary. A synagogue burns down. Some people are involved in, anti-Israeli graffiti. All of a sudden, we're going to stop everybody protesting outside a place of worship. Extraordinary. Maybe we should form the Church of Anarchism. Then they can't protest against us. That's a little joke, sorry. Shouldn't be making jokes. Well, obviously we're going to make jokes. So think about it. Think about the situation we find ourselves in 2024 where governments don't lead. They divide and rule. They acquiesce, they bend to the corporate-owned media and to a lesser degree the government gelded ABC, because somehow they think that's what shapes public opinion and they need somehow to react. Brush it aside. Brush it aside. It's like lint on a coat. Just brush it aside. It'll go away. Why acquiesce? Unbelievable. Now, just in case you think that everything is safe in the land of milk and honey, a few things I'd like to remind you about. Look, if you find yourself in Melbourne on the 19th of December, we're having a picnic. I know, that's a very radical concept, a picnic to which we are invited to bring food and drinks in the Parliamentary Gardens. No, they are not. This is the Victorian Parliamentary Gardens. No, they are not in Parliament. They're the gardens next to Parliament House, the corner of Lonsdale and Spring Street in Melbourne. And if you're a listener to the Anarchist World this week, come along, meet like-minded people, have a relaxing afternoon from midday to 3 p.m. Just come along, all right? It's periods like this when people need to get together, get away from the net, get away from the Zooming, meet real-life, flesh and blood people, and maybe be able to, continue those associations in the future. So think about that. Now, on the 20th of January, 2025, yes, that's next year, 20th of January, it's a Monday, we'll be holding the annual Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner Commemoration at midday on Monday the 20th of January. Most likely the first hour of the ceremony, which will be led by Wollongong Elder Janet Galpin, who will be doing Welcome to Country. We will be broadcast Community Radio 3CR, and then we will march down or walk down to the Victoria Markets, to the place we think these men were buried. So who are they? Well, you realise most of the slaughter that occurred with colonisation was, a hidden affair, smallpox-encrusted blankets, disease, swords, poison. But see, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner were part of a five-member group. Yeah, 5 members, survivors of the Great Tasmanian Slaughter, who were sent to Victoria to civilise the Victorian blacks under the tutelage of Mr. Robertson. And 5 of them, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner, and 3 women, Planabina, Putirana and Truganini, kind of went a little bit feral and were involved in a war or engagement with the colonial authorities in order to try to force people back into Melbourne. They were arrested. The 3 women were acquitted. Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner were hung on the 20th of January 1842, 183 years later. We commemorate them at the Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner Monument, which was an initiative of the Anarchist Media Institute. I'm very proud to be part of that. So come along, listen to the speakers, walk to the Victoria Markets. You don't have to call anybody, just turn up at midday at the monument site, which is the corner of Franklin Street and Victoria Parade in Melbourne. So hopefully you'll take the day off, come and join us, listen to some speakers, meet like-minded people, get involved in activities. One of the first major activities of 2025 we're involved in organising. So thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Now, just a few things to remember. If you are in Melbourne today, and I hate to use Melbourne all the time, but obviously you can organise things in your part of the world. Nothing stops you. But if you are in Melbourne today, which is the 11th of December, come and join us tonight at the Alicia Restaurant at the corner of Hope Street and Sydney Road in Brunswick for a meal. Meet like-minded people. Have a good night out. You need it in this situation we find ourselves in. And if you can't do that, come and join us on the 18th. That's the following Wednesday at the Footscray Hotel at 48 Hopkins Street in Footscray at 6:30 p.m. So, lots of things happening. But I think the important thing to remember is, as I said at the beginning of the program, I can be as stupid or as erudite as you like. I can be as obtuse and as intelligent as you like. But the fact is that ultimately, change comes, as we saw in Syria in the last few days, is by people taking action. So when you take action, think about the consequences. Think about the narrative, because they love us to be violent, because that means that they can actually use all the power at their disposal to destroy the evil, that's you and me, which is grown in society. So ultimately, power comes from you taking action. Desert your computer, desert your couch, get out, get involved, if not with us, with somebody else. That's the important thing. That's what changes things. That's why they want to ban protests. That's why they're concerned. They'd like it to be a little discussion between them and the media, and we just watch and cast a ballot every 3 to 4 years to keep them in power. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. You can leave pleasant messages on 0439 395 489. I've got a bank chasing me at the minute. I want a bank check. They want to put into an account. Don't listen to them. Just you stand your ground. It doesn't matter what it is. Stand your ground. And ultimately, as we saw in Syria, you will succeed. If you acquiesce, you never have a chance of succeeding. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week. Courtesy of the Community Radio Network, you can leave pleasant messages on 0439 395 489. That's 0439 395 489, YouTube channel, public interest before corporate interests. Listen in next week to The Anarchist World This Week.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World This Week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Are you a 3CR subscriber?
We really need our listeners to subscribe to the station. It helps us remain financially independent and is an important part of our community governance.
It's just $40 concession, $80 waged, $150 for a band or organisation, and $300 solidarity.
Become a 3CR subscriber today.
3CR Radical Radio.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.